He called me at 11:47 at night, and that alone told me something was off. Lucas was the kind of man who would move his own couch, hide his own problems, and smile through a broken rib if he had to. So when I heard his voice and he only said, "Can you come get me?" I was already reaching for my keys. He sent me the name of a place downtown I'd been to once for a birthday dinner. Not the kind of place where you expected to pick your best friend up off the pavement after midnight. When I got there, he was sitting on the low brick wall beside the parking lot with his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. For a second, I almost didn't recognize him. Not because of how he looked exactly, because of how still he was. Lucas had always carried energy like he had a motor under his skin. Even tired, even stressed, even pissed off, he was always moving somehow. Tapping a foot, checking his phone, talking with his hands. But that night, he just sat there like somebody had unplugged him. I parked, got out, and walked over. "You good?" He let out this breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was nothing funny in it. "No," he said. "Not really." That hit harder than if he'd tried to joke. I stood there a second, then said, "Can you stand up?" He nodded once. It took him 2 tries. I got him into the passenger seat and shut the door. The inside of the car filled with the smell of cold air, expensive cologne, and a long bad night. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes while I pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes, neither of us said anything. I kept waiting for him to start talking the way people do when the worst part is over and they finally have somebody there. But he didn't. He just looked out the window like he was watching a life he'd already missed. About halfway to his house, I said, "What happened?" He rubbed a hand over his face. I let it get too far. What got too far? He was quiet so long I thought he wouldn't answer. "Everything," he said finally. "Work, money, all of it." I kept thinking I could fix it before anybody saw it. I glanced at him. Anybody meaning Claire? He didn't even look at me. Especially Claire. That was the first moment I understood this night hadn't started in that restaurant. It had probably started months ago. Lucas and I had known each other since we were 19. I'd seen him lose deals, get into fights, bury family, build his company from nothing bigger than a rented office and stubbornness. I had never seen him sound ashamed of himself. That was new, and worse than anger. By the time we turned onto his street, he'd gone quiet again. The porch light was on. I figured I'd help him to the door, make sure he got inside, maybe lie for him if I had to, then head home. That was the plan right up until Claire opened the door. The first thing that hit me was not that she looked good, though she did. It was that she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Hair pulled back badly, sweater hanging loose off one shoulder, no makeup, face pale. She looked like somebody who had been standing in the same invisible brace position for months. Her eyes went straight to Lucas, then to me, and I saw 2 things at once. Fear and relief. "Oh, thank God," she said, already stepping aside. Between the 2 of us, we got him inside. He was heavy in that deadweight way where a man isn't fighting you, but he isn't helping either. We got him to the couch instead of trying for the stairs. Claire pulled a blanket from the armchair. I took off his shoes. She tucked the blanket over him without a word. For a minute, we moved around each other like we'd done it before, even though we hadn't. I adjusted the lamp lower. She set a glass of water on the table. He mumbled something neither of us caught and turned toward the back cushions. Then the room went quiet. The silence in that house said more than he ever could. If you're enjoying my story, please like and subscribe. I straightened up. He'll sleep it off. Claire nodded, but she didn't move. I grabbed my keys from the table. I should go? She looked toward the couch, then toward the kitchen, then back at me. Would you stay for a coffee? It wasn't said in a way that made anything ugly out of it. It sounded like what it was. A tired woman who didn't want to be alone with a house full of bad silence just yet. So I said yes. The kitchen light was softer than the living room lamp. She set mugs out without asking how I took mine, then stopped and asked anyway, like her mind was half a step behind the rest of her. Black, I said. She nodded. Right. That word stuck with me. Right. Like she already knew it and hated that she did. We stood there while the machine worked. Then she leaned both palms on the counter and said, very quietly, "He didn't tell you either, did he?" No. She gave one short nod like that confirmed something. And then, little by little, she told me. About the partner who'd moved money where it wasn't supposed to go. About accounts that didn't make sense. About lawyers. About letters Lucas kept hiding in his office drawer. About the way he'd been saying he was just tired, just busy, just handling it. About how every time she asked what was wrong, he'd tell her he was protecting her, when really he was just shutting another door. I didn't interrupt much. There wasn't anything smart to say. At one point, she wrapped both hands around her mug and looked down into it. I kept trying to stay on his side, she said. And I still am. That's the worst part. I still am. But I don't know how to help someone who won't let me stand next to him. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. And she looked back. That was the moment the line showed up. Nothing happened. Nobody moved closer. Nobody said the wrong thing. But something changed anyway, and both of us knew it. Not because we wanted it to. Because the truth had entered the room, and once it did, it made everything feel more exposed than it had 5 minutes earlier. I finished my coffee too fast, thanked her, and left before staying started to feel easy. On the drive home, the roads were empty and black and quiet. I should have been thinking about Lucas, about the mess he was in, about what he needed me to do next. Instead, I kept seeing Claire in that kitchen, holding herself together by habit. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, I already knew I was carrying something I had no business wanting. The next morning, Lucas called me at 9:12. I stared at his name on my screen for a second before answering. Part of me thought he'd pretend none of it happened. That would have been more like the version of him I knew. Instead, he said, "I owe you an apology." His voice was rough but clear, not cheerful, not hiding behind anything either. "You don't owe me that," I said. "I do." He paused. "And I owe you more than that, probably." I sat down at my kitchen table. "How bad is it?" He let out a breath. "Bad enough that I'm embarrassed to say it out loud." "Then say it anyway." There was a long silence, and then, finally, he started talking for real. Not all at once. Lucas didn't work like that. He gave me pieces. His business partner had been shifting money around without telling him. By the time Lucas caught it, contracts were already compromised, accounts were tangled, and a couple of people were asking questions with the kind of tone that meant this was no longer a private mess. He'd spent weeks trying to patch holes himself, convinced that if he could just survive one more day, one more meeting, one more payment, he could fix it before Claire ever had to know how bad it was. Only now it was too big to hide. "Do you have a lawyer?" I asked. "Not one I trust." "I know two. I'll send you both." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I should have called you sooner." That part one believed. He should have. But Lucas had always treated needing help like losing. By noon I'd texted him 2 names, called one guy I knew from an old contract fight, and cleared my afternoon. When Lucas asked if I could come by, I went. He looked better than the night before, but only in the way a man looks better after sleep and a shower. The weight was still there. Claire opened the door this time before I knocked twice, like she'd been half expecting me. She gave me a small tired smile. "He's in the office." Just that. Nothing extra. But even that tiny moment felt too sharp. I stepped inside, thanked her, and kept moving. Lucas's office looked like the inside of his head had spilled onto every flat surface. Printed statements, legal pads, open folders, his laptop charging beside a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know it's a disaster." "Good," I said, "because that saves time." He actually laughed a little at that, and hearing it made me feel like maybe he was still in there somewhere. For the next few days, I became the guy who answered when he called and showed up when he needed another set of eyes. I sat with him while he organized timelines, helped him strip the emotion out of emails that were better not sent angry, pushed him toward people who actually knew the law instead of his usual habit of trying to outwork a problem. And slowly, because he had no energy left for pretending, he started acting like himself with me again. That should have made things simpler. It didn't, because Claire was there at the edges of all of it, bringing coffee into the office and leaving without interrupting, asking once, quietly, whether Lucas had eaten, texting me a thank you after I left one night when he was too wrung out to speak. Nothing improper, nothing I could point to, but every small contact landed harder than it should have. A week later, she asked if I had 10 minutes to meet near her office. I almost said no. I knew better than to create a private space with her if I didn't absolutely have to. But she said it was about Lucas, and that part was true enough that I couldn't hide behind caution. We met at a coffee place on a corner downtown where people came in suits and stared at laptops. Safe, bright, public. She was already there when I walked in, hands around a paper cup, shoulders tight. She looked more put together than the first night, but not rested. More like someone doing her best impression of okay. "Thanks for coming," she said. "Of course." For a while we talked exactly the way we were supposed to. About Lucas. About whether he was listening to the lawyer. About what he was saying versus what he was avoiding. About how he seemed a little more present, a little less shut down. Then she looked down at her cup and said, "He trusts you more than anybody." I didn't answer right away. She lifted her eyes to me. "I'm glad he does." There was something in the way she said it that made the noise of the whole place fall back for a second. I should have kept it simple. Should have just nodded. Instead, I said, "That trust matters to me." She held my gaze a little too long. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me to feel it. "I know," she said. That was it. 2 words. But there was too much in them. I leaned back, looked away, and asked something practical about Lucas's schedule just to put the walls back up. She followed me there immediately. That was the worst part. She understood exactly what I was doing, and instead of making it harder, she helped me do it. When we stood to leave, she said, very softly, "Thank you for not disappearing." I nodded once. "I'm here for him." She gave a small sad smile. "I know that too." After that, I made a decision. I still answered Lucas's calls. Still helped. Still showed up. But I stopped lingering if Claire was the only one in the room. I kept our messages short. Useful. Clean. I gave the connection nowhere to grow. And she noticed. Of course she noticed. She never complained, never pushed, never tried to pull me back in. She respected the distance immediately. That should have made it easier. Instead, it made me want her more, because it proved this thing between us wasn't cheap. It wasn't built on sneaking around or saying reckless things. It was built on both of us seeing the edge clearly and refusing to step over it. Doing the right thing should feel clean. Most days, it just felt like losing something before I'd ever had the right to touch it. I chose my best friend's trust over my own heart. Was I right to step back, or is love worth the betrayal? Let me know in the comments. By the middle of the next month, the panic had started to change shape. It still wasn't good. Lucas's company was still bleeding money. The legal mess wasn't over, and every phone call seemed to come with another new problem attached to it. But it had stopped feeling like a man drowning alone in the dark. Now it felt more like a man standing in a wreckage site in daylight, finally forced to look at what was left. That sounds better than it was. It wasn't better, just clearer. He started calling me less late at night and more in the middle of the day. That alone told me something had shifted. He was sleeping again, at least a little, eating more than coffee and whatever protein bar he found in the car, showing up to meetings looking like a human being instead of someone who hadn't been fully present in weeks. One Tuesday afternoon, I met him outside the lawyer's office after a long meeting. He loosened his tie, looked up at the sky like he'd forgotten weather existed, and said, "I think this might actually stay survivable." I gave him a look. "That your professional legal opinion?" "It's my exhausted idiot opinion." "That sounds more accurate." He smiled, and for the first time in a while it looked natural. We ended up at a place nearby with decent burgers and bad coffee. He ate like somebody remembering food had a purpose. For a while we talked business, numbers, timelines, all the practical stuff that had taken over his life. Then, somewhere between fries and the second refill, his face changed. Not dramatic, just flatter. He set his cup down and said, "Claire and I tried to have dinner last night without talking about any of this." I waited. We made it 12 minutes. I didn't say anything, because I knew this wasn't really about dinner. He stared at the table. That should have been a break, right? 1 normal hour. But I kept realizing I didn't know what to say to her unless it was logistics. Bills. Calls. What the lawyer said. When I'm home. When I'm not. He rubbed his thumb against the edge of the paper napkin until it tore. "And the truth is," he said, "I don't think that started with this." I looked at him. "No." He shook his head. "This just took away my excuses." That line stayed with me, because I'd seen enough by then to know he was right. The business problem had cracked things open, but it hadn't built the distance in that house. That had been there already. In the pauses. In the careful way Claire asked him things. In the way he answered like every conversation was something to manage instead of step into. Still, hearing him say it out loud felt different. A week later I was at his place again, helping him organize paperwork before another meeting. Claire was home. I could hear cabinet doors in the kitchen, water running, the ordinary sounds of someone living in the next room. Lucas kept losing focus. Not on the documents. On everything else. Finally, he put one file down and leaned back in his chair. "I think she's done being patient with me," he said. I kept my eyes on the stack in front of me. "Maybe she's done being shut out." He nodded slowly. "Yeah." There was no anger in him when he said it. That was the part that mattered. If anything, he sounded tired in a cleaner way than before. Less panicked. More honest. That night, as I was leaving, Claire walked me to the door because Lucas had taken a call upstairs. We stood there in that narrow, quiet space where people usually say easy things. Is he doing better? She asked. Some ways, yes. She nodded, like she already knew what the other ways were. I should have left it there. Instead, I said, he's at least telling the truth now. Her eyes met mine for a second. Sometimes the truth comes late. There was too much in that sentence for the space between us. I opened the door before either of us could make it worse. Then, 2 weeks after that, Lucas called and asked me to come over. Just me. No paperwork. I found him in the backyard with 2 beers already open on the table between the chairs. The air had turned cool again. He looked strange in a way I couldn't place at first. Then I got it. He looked relieved. Not happy. Definitely not happy. But like a man who had finally stopped lying to himself and was too tired to start again. He handed me a bottle, sat down, and said, Claire and I are separating. He said it plainly. No build-up. No performance. I sat across from him and waited. We talked for hours last night, he went on. Really talked. Probably more honestly than we have in years. He stared out into the yard. And once we started, there was no point pretending this was only about the company. That just forced us to admit what was already broken. I took a drink and said nothing. He looked over at me. I kept thinking if I fixed work, everything else would snap back into place. But that was just me bargaining with reality. There wasn't much to say to that either, so I let him keep going. She's not wrong, he said. About any of it. I disappeared a long time before all this. I just did it slowly enough to call it responsibility. He laughed once, bitter and tired. Turns out being needed is not the same thing as being present. We sat with that for a while. Then he said something I didn't expect. You showed up. I looked at him. Of course I did. No. He shook his head. I mean when I was at my worst. When I was lying to everybody, including myself. You still showed up. He didn't say anything else after that, but I knew what was inside it. Trust. Gratitude. Maybe even an apology for all the months he'd gone missing while still standing in front of people. And that made what I was carrying feel heavier, not lighter. Because the line had changed now. The marriage was ending. The truth was out in the open. But none of that made me eager. It made me careful. If anything, I wanted more distance, not less. I was not going to be the man who saw a door crack open and rushed through it. So when Claire texted me 3 days later to thank me for everything I'd done for Lucas, I kept my answer simple. When I saw her name on my phone after that, I let it sit a few minutes before replying. Not to play games. To make sure every word I sent could survive being read out loud in a room with him standing there. The strange part was, I think she understood that too. There was no pressure from her. No reaching. No testing. Just the same quiet restraint that had been there from the beginning. Which meant the hardest part was still true. Nothing ugly had happened. Nothing dishonest had happened. And somehow that made wanting her feel even more serious. 3 months passed before I saw Claire alone again. Not by accident. Not because we hadn't had chances. There had been a few group things, a couple of quick check-ins. One time I dropped something off for Lucas, and she happened to be there picking up the last of her boxes. But I kept everything narrow and careful, and so did she. That mattered. Lucas had moved into a rental across town, and was settling into a version of life he never would have chosen, but was at least real. The company was still smaller than before, stripped down, bruised, but alive. He looked older to me. Not in the face exactly. In the way he spoke. Like getting flattened had knocked a certain kind of arrogance out of him for good. Claire had taken a place near the park on the west side. Small apartment, 3rd floor, no elevator, the kind of building with chipped paint near the mailboxes and plants on half the balconies. I only knew that because Lucas mentioned it once in the neutral tone people use when they're trying to prove they can talk about something without bleeding. I didn't go looking for her. Then one Thursday evening, she sent me a message asking if I wanted to walk for 10 minutes, because she was nearby after work. 10 minutes. That was how careful she still was. I read it twice before answering yes. We met near the park just before sunset. Nothing dramatic. Joggers passing by, kids shouting somewhere near the swings, people walking dogs like it was any normal evening in any normal city. She wore a dark coat and had her hands in the pockets when I saw her. For a second, we just looked at each other with that strange awareness people get when too much time has passed and not enough has changed underneath it. You look good, I said. She smiled a little. You too. Then we started walking. At first we talked about ordinary things, almost on purpose. Work. Her new place. The fact that her upstairs neighbor seemed to own a chair made entirely of noise. The fact that Lucas had apparently learned how to cook 3 things and was now acting like he'd crossed an ocean alone. That made us both laugh. and I needed that more than I realized. Because beneath it all, there was still that other conversation waiting. The one that had started months earlier in a kitchen neither of us had forgotten. We walked one full lap around the pond before she slowed near a bench and looked out at the water. "I've been trying to figure out when this became real," she said. I stayed standing for a second, then sat beside her. "Not too close." "I think we both know," I said. She nodded once. "That night." "Yeah." There it was. No pretending. The wind moved a strand of hair across her face, and she tucked it back, buying herself a second. Then she looked at me and said, "I knew you were pulling away on purpose." I was. "I know." She gave a small smile that wasn't really happy, just honest. "Part of me hated it. Part of me was relieved you were doing it." I looked down at my hands. I didn't trust myself to stay close and keep it clean forever. She let that sit between us. Then I said the thing I'd been carrying for too long to dress up. "I wanted you earlier." Her eyes didn't leave my face. "I know," she said quietly. "I wanted you earlier," I repeated. "But Lucas mattered too much to me. And you did too. I wasn't going to build something with you on top of a bad season in somebody else's life. I couldn't do that and still respect either of you." For a second she said nothing. Then she exhaled and looked out across the pond again. "That," she said, "is part of why I could meet you here tonight." We sat there with that, not rushing to turn it into some perfect scene, not pretending it hadn't cost us both something to get there. After a minute she said, "Back then I felt like I was disappearing inside that house. Everybody was worried about him, and they should have been, but I was disappearing too." Her voice stayed calm, but I could hear the old tiredness under it. "You were the first person who looked at me like I was still fully there." I turned toward her. "You were." She laughed once under her breath, wiped at one eye before anything could fall, and shook her head. "You always do that. You say the exact thing, and somehow make it harder to hide from." I'm done hiding from it. That got her attention. I didn't touch her. Not yet. I just said, "I'm not here because there was an empty space and I thought I should step into it. I'm here because even after time passed, even after everything changed, it was still you." That was the moment her whole face softened. Not with surprise. More like relief. "I was hoping," she said, "that if this ever happened, it would happen like this." I nodded. "Me too." When I finally took her hand, it felt quiet. Not reckless. Not stolen. Just true. Later that night, after I walked her to her building and waited until she got inside, I sat in my car for a long minute before starting the engine. Then I called Lucas. I wasn't calling for permission. That would have made it worse somehow. Smaller. Less honest. I called because he was still my friend, and I wasn't going to let him hear it from anywhere else. He picked up on the fourth ring. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I wanted to tell you something myself." He was quiet while I told him. When I finished, there was a long pause. I could hear traffic faintly through his end of the line. Then he said, "I figured maybe one day." I closed my eyes. I never crossed a line with her. "I know," he said. "That hit harder than anything else." He let out a breath. "None of this is simple. But you didn't do this to me." And that was enough. Not perfect. Not painless. But enough. When I drove home, I kept thinking about how badly I'd wanted her the night this all started, and how different it felt now that I could finally admit it without shame.